So welcome to the screencast for section 3.3, and this is about how cells transport materials in and out of them, and a concept called homeostasis. Now homeostasis, just think of that as balance. How do cells stay balanced? So let's take a look at the objectives for this section. They're going to describe different types of passive transport, but also different types of active transport. The important thing for you to realize here is when something gets in or out of the cell passively, that means the cell doesn't use any energy. If it's active transport, that means the cell has had to use energy to get it in or out of the cell. And we'll also look at a brief outline of cell transport in homeostasis. Here's a diagram that I liked. It's not in your textbook, but you'll be able to view it here. This is the plasma membrane or the cell membrane moving across here, and then passive diffusion is when materials just go right through that membrane. Facilitated diffusion is when something goes into it, but it goes through this structure which is in the plasma membrane. This is a protein that floats in the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. And then there's selective. So with facilitated diffusion, almost anything can go through that protein. If it's selected facilitated diffusion, specialized things. And then we have primary active transport using a rich molecule called ATP, an energy-rich molecule. We'll talk about all of this later on. And then we have different types of secondary active transport. And then sometimes when things generally come into the cell, that's called endocytosis. When things generally leave the cell, that's called exocytosis. These are all terms that we'll use in this section. So here's the page that talks about what passive transport is, what simple diffusion, and what osmosis is. Osmosis is diffusion, but it's diffusion of water molecules. So make sure you read this page right here. In this diagram, this represents right here, this represents the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. And what they're saying is if we put some substance outside of the cell, that's what extracellular space means. If we put a substance out here, and over time what will happen is, because there's a high concentration outside, low concentration inside, over time the concentration inside and outside of the cell will even out. That's called equilibrium. So this is diffusion across the cell membrane. Cell doesn't use any energy for this. Here's an example of a way that things get in and out of the cell using the sodium-potassium pump. Now this looks complicated, and this is the first time we've had a complicated diagram like this in the course. ATP is an energy-rich molecule. That's all you have to know. And ATP is sort of like the gasoline for your car. It's what makes the cells go. So ATP is an energy-rich molecule which allows certain processes to take place. And notice the ATP comes down here, releases some energy, and now it's ADP. But this helps drive materials in and out of the cell. Just know that the sodium-potassium pump is a form of active transport. This diagram, figure 320 from your textbook, talks about the difference between exocytosis and endocytosis. So in exocytosis, that's when a cell needs to get rid of something. We've got the cell membrane or the plasma membrane here, and within the cell, something is packaged. It moves that package close to the cell membrane, but then notice what happens to the package, the orange area here. It forms with the plasma membrane, it opens up and it releases its contents out to the outside. That's how exocytosis works. On the endocytosis, if this material is coming into the cell, it comes in, and notice that it's wrapped in the cell membrane. That allows it to come in and not be rejected. So this is the illustration of what's called vesicle. Vesicle just means a container to move things either in or out of the cell. So in order for cells to work correctly, they have to be stable inside. There has to be a stable state maintained inside. So for example, nutrients and salts and other substances have to be kept within a certain range. And maintaining that balance or maintaining those stable conditions is called homeostasis. And it requires constant adjustment. So please read about this. Now you don't have to memorize this diagram, but I think I wanted to show it to you because it shows you how much is going on inside a cell at any one time. all the manufacturing of amino acids and proteins. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about them later. The nutrients going into the cell over here, the waste products coming out of the cell, different materials that have to come in that help build ribosomal RNA or help energy from the mitochondria. Here's our sodium pump moving in and out, oxygen coming into the cell. It's really important that all cells get oxygen. There's basically two things that all cells need. They need oxygen and they need food. They need glucose, energy-rich molecules. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter, in chapter 4. So let's just review real quickly, read the lesson summary here, the major role that the plasma membrane or cell membrane takes in transporting, know the difference between active and passive transport, and what homeostasis is. So this is the end of chapter 3. Remember, make sure you read and study the chapter, and we'll see you for chapter 4.